which one of those clouds going by in the sky it's going to. Right?
It's not one of the clouds from, it's a cloud in Mayo.
It's a Mayo cloud.
The cloud in Mayo, right? Of course. But if I wait 6 hours, will that cloud come here?
Yep, she's gone.
like magic, Pat, right? It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. I was looking at all the fellows that have been to Ballinglen, and I saw that you arrived in 1994, and you continued every year until 2006. And you have 3 works in the collection, and 2 of them date from 1994. One is a view of Ballycastle from the Bog Road, and Ballycastle is very visible in that painting. You can see the church, you can see some of the buildings. So while it's lushly painted, and while paint appears to be one of the subjects in that work, the figurative elements are also part of the subject matter and are also visible. And the other one is fields. I think you call it fields near Ballycastle, but it's like a farm building,
right?
Also in very lush fields. And then the third piece is a piece called From Carramore, and that was painted in 2006. So that was painted on that last fellowship that you participated in. I'm just curious and interested if you can recollect those works. If you can say something about how you arrived into Ballycastle in '94 as a painter. How you arrived in with your perception, and how you approached those works, and then maybe from there you could bring us through onto that last work in your last fellowship in 2006, which is From Carramore. Now, I don't know, is that close to Carramore Strand or Carramore Lake? Because
Carramore, as I remember it, was a locale. If you can imagine coming around where Peter and Margot used to live and going down that road past the cemetery on the left, on the right.
Yeah.
And coming to that first intersection, I think where Aggie used to live, or there was an old woman who lived there.
Ah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember?
I know, yeah.
She was like from another world.
Yeah.
So if you turn right there, you would go past Keith's house, I believe, and then you would climb up, up. And at the very top, in the early years that I was there, they were foresting up there. They were growing forest. Right. Yeah. And you would go all the way up to the top. And then from there, it would be a slow descent, down to Lacken.
Yeah.
But at the very top, my memory was they called that locale Carramore.
Oh yeah, it's possible. And you're looking at the beach area, the bay in Lacken, or you're looking at the beach area in Ballycastle?
I'm looking at the beach area in Lacken.
Yeah.
In Lacken. It was a place I spent a lot of time. And I haven't seen that. I haven't looked at that painting in a while, but I remember. I mean, I looked at it fairly recently in the internet, and it was a place that how you get to know places. You're attracted to something, and you kind of follow it, and then over time you build up a relationship with that place. That it's not just.
It's nice to hear you say that and describing it like that, because for the RHA catalogue, they asked me to write an article about Ballinglen. And in that article, which is a very personal account of Ballinglen, I mentioned the fact that artists discover places, integrate them completely in their work and in their being, and also, you know, tell other artists about it. Because I remember I worked mostly in the direction of Balmullet, you know, around Ballycastle, but heading out that direction. While you worked a lot above Ballycastle and in those areas, looking down at vast sort of areas of fields and the sea and things. But we all discovered places around Ballycastle. And what was nice, I think we were all generous in that we told other artists about these areas, you know, generally in conversations, either in pokes or
sitting around.
So it's nice. You have a nice memory of it. But can you say something, the two first works from 94 when you were out and that last work, when I look at them, they're very different works. You know, one is sort of, the first two, as I said, are a little bit more figurative. They're more about the top of, you know, the Pacific areas in around Ballycastle. And the other one is about something else. And I'd like you maybe to say something about the first two and the differences, what happened, because there's a time space of 12 years, huh?
Yeah, well, you know, you were saying something about the way we discover places.
Yeah.
And in relation to what I was saying, and I think what I learned, or what I came to understand, was that not only do we discover places, but then by way of how we build a relationship in those places, we also discover something about us. Yep. You know, that the place opens up a conversation with ourselves that we could never have anticipated, perhaps. I mean, this has always been my experience. And I worked the same way in the city when I was a city painter. When I arrived in 94, I was a city painter. I've been working for 12 years in the city, also in the country, because I would go out to Indiana in the Midwest every spring and paint farmland. But what happened in those years between the first visit and the last visit was really not so much about discovering yet more places out there, but I discovered something about how to look and how to feel in the landscape. Because, you know, we're not just painting scenes. You know, the painter is also painting himself. In a sense, that it's not just about objective rendering or, you know, objective inventory. It's not an inventory of what's out there. It's what I found slowly from working out of doors in that locale in Ballycastle, in that engine of transformational weather systems and change, was I began to recognize the little meter, you know, like when you record, say, like if you're playing music or recording and you see the meter moving in relation to the voice, you know, the meter is registering something. And because of my education, you know, because my training was so academically oriented, I came to painting in the same way that, say, a butterfly collector might chase after butterflies with a net. That, you know, specimens. And what I came to understand, and it's not like I was working for the corporate world as a butterfly chaser, you know, I mean, the painting from the first summer, I felt like, you know, those paintings were, you know, they weren't someone else's paintings. They were my paintings, but they were a continuation of who I had been in the city. That in other words, I was arriving with a kind of a set or a fixed understanding of what it was I was doing, in terms of how I looked. But what that place showed me, and it didn't take long, because I can remember the first summer at the very beginning, in the cottage that we used to stay in out in Dunfini, there was a little lane on the other side of our garden that went down to an old farm. And sometimes I would go into that lane to paint, because from it offered views that I couldn't quite see. You know how you develop a relationship with place where you get to know the contours, and then suddenly one day you're taking a walk or something and you see the same place, but in a very different way, even though it's so subtle. So I went into that lane on the first day because I didn't want to get in the car. I just took my easel and I went down that lane, and I came back like two and a half, 3 hours later. And I said to Pam, I think we have to go home. I can't deal with this place. It's insane. Because what was happening on that day, it was one of those days where nothing stood still. It was crazy. Dark light, like a cast light, like a searchlight, casting around. And Pam, in her wisdom, said, just relax and keep at it. And I kept at it. And what happened was, slowly, I began to recognize, even in the first summer, that I could chase the ephemerality. I could chase the transience in a way that was unlike any attitude that I had toward painting, because I always saw the paintings as holding on to something that was fixed. And this experience there over those weeks began to suggest to me that I could follow my way into a place where there was no determined sense of arrival, that there was that the destination of the painting could be part of the process of making the painting. So that's where paintings like The Final Summer came from, although of course it began to happen long before The Final Summer, but that one in the collection is from The Final Summer. And that's what happened. I mean, the place showed me that needle I was beginning to become aware of was my own emotional response. And my own emotional response was something that I had always kept sort of restrained or in the background, because I didn't think that was what painting was about.
And do you think that came about? Because I've experienced the same thing. I'm wondering, do you think that comes about because that light is so transient, because it's changing constantly, because it's repainting the objects, the landscape that you look at, it's repainting them constantly, it's deleting them, it's reconfiguring them. They often take on different shapes depending on the light.
Totally. And that's something else that this whole thing is about. I mean, do you remember the rock and roll band from England called The Who?
Yeah.
And they did an opera in the early 70s called Tommy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And I've been listening to it in my studio. It was like very much on my screen at the time that it came out. And I was listening to it recently, and there's this one song when they took Tommy to visit the Acid Queen. Remember, like she claimed that she was gonna just spend a night with me and I'll reorganize your mind. And I feel like that's what happened to me in Ballycastle. And it wasn't Ballycastle, the village. It was the totality experiential totality of the sky and the clouds and the color and the light and the dark and the nights and the whole thing. It was incredible. I mean, it's hard to believe that it's been so many years since I've been back, because it is like a constant point of reference for me in the catalog of my experience. Like on the shelf, conceptually speaking, of my experience in painting, those summers and that one winter sit like unlike anything else. And I feel like I used to go home every summer at the end of the summer thinking, I'm just ready to start painting. You know, what I really wanted at the end of every summer after the first few years was to have a studio there with buckets of color and a huge floor mop for working on 4x4 foot paintings. Because I felt like I was ready for that. Like the place had entered my blood by the end of the summer, and that I felt like Achilles, you know, going out in battle with his shield, you know, except I didn't have my shield. I was wide open, you know, that the place, I mean, you know, the place opens us up in a way, you know, it brings us closer to a possibility of who we are. And I suppose as painters, we come to understand who we are by way of the paintings.
Yeah, I was talking to Natalie Meyer, a German painter, beautiful painter, that was also a fellow. There is also a fellow of Ballinglen. So I was talking to her a couple of days ago, and I mentioned the naturalist Prager. Do you know him? An Irish Prager.
I don't.
I think he talks about the vastness and the desolate landscape on the endless blanket bog. But he says it's the loneliest place on earth. But then he says that he goes on to say that it's the most remarkable, beautiful place to be, because the confrontation with it throws you back on yourself. And that's what you described a few minutes ago when you were talking about how you end up painting yourself more or less in that landscape, because you're thrown back onto yourself. You can't really cope with all of this thing that's changing all the time. So in fact, you do cope with it, but you cope with it by trying to situate yourself within that sort of transient vastness. And I'm wondering if that's what happens in that landscape.
Well, I think so. And you know, there are so many paintings that I wanted to make. Like I never painted beyond Belderg, but I took many trips out to Caratag, and I would think that probably the most remarkable experiences of feeling and empathic connection that I have ever felt in my life were out there on foot. The experiences that I had there with my children, with David Brewster walking around. I remember one time, these were like, you know, when I was 17, I hitchhiked around Europe after high school. Not everywhere, but I took a trip alone. And I have memories of Paris and here and there, but nothing that rivals the power that I experienced. I mean, going out to Caratag was like shooting heroin, but in the best sense. I mean, I remember, I can remember the feeling. I mean, it was like being with the love of one's life, you know, the feeling of being there and that space and the color and the shapes and that sense of, I wouldn't call it desolateness or loneliness. I'm not so sure I would even call it emptiness, because I never saw any of that as empty.
No.
I mean, empty of maybe buildings, but I felt so, I mean, it was just like, it was like drinking the best pineapple juice imaginable, you know, like fresh. It was just, and the thing about the whole experience of being there is it wasn't just going to this spot or going to that spot. It was the way that everything layered, including meeting other artists. You know, we had great conversations, the two of us, and other people, and Donald and Keith and many other people. But also, I remember things like the first time I went out to Caratag in '94. Pam and the children had discovered it before I did. And I remember the way they stacked the turf blocks.
Yeah.
There was one family that stacked them it was like a Richard Serra piece. You know, it was this huge piece of installation with the bricks stacked up with the most incredible knowing. You know, as they probably from father to son had learned this, or mother to daughter, you know, whomever was doing the stacking.
And is that a turf stack just left up the road as you drive down to Ballinglen?
You know, I can't remember if it was on the right or the left, but it was
Paddy Kinty's. We've often stopped and looked at it, taken photographs, spoken to him. I've often even contemplated trying to get him to make it within a gallery situation, just because it's like a Richard Serra, or it's just so brutal. And
they're still doing it. It's still there, Pat.
He still makes them, yeah.
Wow. I must come back, if only to see that. I mean, you know, I can remember I went out to Caratag once with David, and I'd already known the place. I don't remember which summer this was. Maybe it was '96 or '97. And we each went our own way. And I parked, you know, when you first go across the green there, and I think there's a sculpture there, I remember now. And I parked there, but then I walked around the whole thing, you know, off to the left, and we re-met on the other side. And it was the end of the day, and the sun was getting low, and the light was smashing the western side of that point. And I remember we met up, and the gulls were circling and screaming, and they were like having their late afternoon thing. And I was speechless. You know, I felt like the face of God had been revealed to me in the last 2 hours. And we had to go back because Margot had organized a dinner for the artists. And there were people I wanted to meet. I think some people who were in from England. Maybe that was the time that Norman Ackroyd was there. I can't remember visit. He was on a ship off the coast there on some islands. And I remember thinking with David, like, how are we going to go back? Like, how are we going to speak? Like, how can we leave this? It was like we were in the chamber of divine splendor. And I thought, how can we go back to the big city? I mean, the big city being Ballycastle. So, you know, I think that it's not only the spots themselves, but the totality of the experience that, given enough time in a visit. Like, I can remember it was around that summer that I was looking at that turf installation. Because I didn't like that kind of art. I didn't admire Richard Serra. I mean, I love Richard Serra at this point, but at that time, you know, I was trained as an anti-modernist. in my education. And it took me a long time to become appreciative of other things that didn't look like what I knew. But, you know, Margot opened my eyes to many things. And I remember around that time, she lent me a catalog of Agnes Martin's drawings. Oh, wow. Which of course, you know, are, you know, like I mean, I love her paintings, but, you know, I've seen them both in real life. And if I had to choose which ones I would like to have at home, it would be the things on paper. And I remember it was around that time that I was beginning to connect the dots, so to speak, between experience in life, you know, as a looker and as an appreciator, and art, you know, and all these things were kind of feeding each other, if you know what I mean. I initially stopped coming to Ballycastle because I thought it was going to be very short term. You know, I just had to step away because the impact that the kinds of paintings I was making there, which felt very honest to me, the impact they were having on my life, say with galleries, you know, it was how I survived. You know, I wasn't teaching at that point. I didn't have any other income. I didn't have an alternative income, and I was raising children. And those paintings were flipping people out here. They had narrow minds in terms of, you know, they couldn't look at them. So I stopped coming because that last summer was so difficult. I heard my dealer's voice in my head, you know, saying, no, we don't want those paintings. So I took a little break, and then the economy crashed in 2008 and nothing was ever the same, you know. And the only places I could go were places where people paid for me to go, you know, like completely. So I went, you know, I started teaching in Italy with a school that was located in Israel. And more recently, I spent a summer in Greece, which it was the first time I'd been there. And the impact of that, I mean, the impact of Italy was enormous. And you know, I understand now that I needed Italy because I needed Italy to bring me to bring my painting mind to a consideration of color in a way that I hadn't really been and wasn't able to think on the coast, because, you know, color has a certain conversation there, you know, related to naturalistic observation or whatever. And Italy brings with it a completely different palette of not only actual materiality, but of mood. But Greece was really remarkable for me in the sense that it brought me back to a consideration of figurative painting. Of figurative painting. I mean, in a way, figurative, you know, with figurative presence, figures. But none of it compares to what happened in Ballycastle, because that was 13 long summers. And the chemistry of the possibility there of what can go on. I mean, that's really where I learned about what happens when you can really let the kite string out, when you can let the kite string out very, very far until the string is all the way out, and then to take the scissors and cut the string. So, you know, that what I came to understand there was kind of exceptional. And the other part, that the conversations with other artists, Eddie Kennedy, you know, like all of the people I've met there over the years, the conversations were part of the evolving mystery. In terms of, I remember there was a woman there early on who lived in Belfast at the time, and she was an installation artist, and I'm trying to remember her name. Kathy. I can't remember her last name. She was there a couple of times, and she would go down to the beach and do things with stuff that was going to be washed away.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it was she who was going into the abandoned cottages when they were still abandoned, you know, before money arrived. And she was doing like snow angels on the floor.
Oh, yeah.
And documenting all this. I always felt very small there.
Yeah.
You know, very small, but that wasn't threatening or intimidating.
No.
It sort of felt right. I mean, that's why I went, you know, to be in the presence, to remind myself in whose presence I was. And I don't mean in a theological way, although, you know, in a way it is theological, but not in a dogmatic theological way. I can remember, I have a photograph somewhere from one of the early summers when my children were very young. I remember watching maybe I was only with my eldest son because the younger one might have been a little too young for that, because this was like, you know, pretty intense. And I can remember the waves were insane. And the flying up and, you know, this stuff. And they were little boys. And I could feel their sense of excitement and pleasure and a little bit of, I don't want to call it fear, but just wonder, like on the edge. And the whole thing was incredible, what the sky was doing. And we all felt so small in a way, but so large at the same time, because of how we become part of what's going on. And I believe, I think that it wouldn't be happening if we were with a crowd. You know, there's right?
You mentioned being on the edge. I've often thought about this place, you know, this whole area of North Mayo as being on the edge. You know, it's literally on the edge of Europe. It's the last stop before your hometown, Philadelphia. But you're also on the edge as regards painting and the context of a painter within society. You're just really on the edge. Like, you're also on the edge of culture almost. So you really don't have the same sort of comfort zone that you would have in a city full of galleries. So you are confronted with yourself, and you've got to create a new context for yourself as a painter, I think.
Totally. I mean, Pat, you put your finger on the word comfort zone.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was taken so far out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
But I try to talk to students at school about this, that I really feel that that's the place to live as a painter.
Oh, I think so, yeah.
That when we're in our comfort zone, we don't have fullest access to ourselves because our imagination is no longer being employed or challenged. You know, and I guess at the end of the day, for me, that might be one of the most critical pieces of the whole puzzle that living on that coast revealed.
Yeah.
Italy was amazing. I went many times, you know, and in a sense, I just wanted more and more, but it's a very different kind of conversation. Like, you can't get away from civilization. You can't get away from people. You know, it's a whole different story. And there's something about what that being on that coast reveals within us, you know, where it takes us to in ourself. I remember my friend David Brewster said in the first or second summer we were there, he said, well, you know, no one's looking over our shoulder here. You know, when you go to Italy, you have the history of European art, you know, looking over your shoulder. I mean, you can't escape from it. But in Mayo, I mean, because when I first came to Mayo, I didn't know about any of the Irish artists. I didn't know what people were doing. I mean, I knew about Yeats, the painter, the brother, but I didn't feel like there were any points of reference for the kinds of pictures that had been made here before.
Yeah, yeah.
And slowly I began to see the work through the foundation of people like Nick Miller.
Yeah,
who have been there, and I discovered your work and many other people. But I felt in those years a sense of liberation from who's looking over the shoulder, that we were kind of on our own. I mean, I so want to go back as soon as this nonsense that we're in is over, because I want to, it's really way past time to reapproach this place and see what it will mean to me now, as a very different kind of worker. I don't want to just return to who I was in 2006. And there were so many people who were pulled into such places there. I mean, I'm just thinking of American artists, my friend Nisa Grassi and Michael Olaszewski. The work they did there was kind of revelatory, in terms of where this place took us could not have been anticipated.
No, I think it's true. And I think it has some sort of draw on people, because many of the people, you included, didn't visit once. It's hard to go through the fellows that have been there. It's hard to find fellows that have only visited once. They do exist, but there aren't many. So I think the mystery about the place is that it's so hard, so impossible to situate, to comprehend, that you need to return and then often stay. Nuala Clark lives in Ballycastle now. Prior to that, she was in New York. Keith comes from the north of Ireland, lives in Ballycastle. We have a place now out in Stonefield.
I heard Magda showed me photographs once when I saw her at an opening.
Yeah, we brought her out one day, and as soon as we hit that road, you leave the road to Belmullet and you head up past Rossport, heading up to Carrotag. And she said, it's like going to the moon. The Celts had this belief that there were thin places. And thin places were places where you could, for a moment, see the future, experience the future, and past at the same time. It's part of an old Celtic belief. And they call them thin places, meaning, I think, that the veil that separates time sometimes becomes very thin.
Beautiful.
So the wall between the future and the past and the present becomes very thin.
Wow.
So you can experience both at the same time, of all three. I tend to walk the landscape a lot, make small watercolors and drawings and that, but I tend to work in the studio. Whereas before I worked in situ. When you're walking that landscape alone, you encounter places that you feel this is sort of a thin place, right?
Beautiful, beautiful description. And, it reminds me of a story. I got to know a farmer. His name was Tommy Burke, and he lived on the road above the Standing Stone in Dauphiny. There's a high, the road that comes at it empties out a little further down the main road.
Yeah, I know it, Jeff. It's a nice road.
I got to know Tommy Burke, and I asked him one day if I could walk up the hill, the hill behind the house, which I saw from my cottage. There's that big hill. And I put on my boots, and it was a cloudy day. and I climbed the hill, and the hill was very boggy, you know, and the cows had pushed their legs.
Yeah, I know it.
And I got to the top, and I'd been working. You know, I was, you know, I was wearing a sweater and I was hot, and I got to the top, and it was pure moving mist. It was just moving mist like veils, and you could see through a little bit here. And what I was looking out toward was where they cut turf, you know, further in that direction. And I remember looking in the distance, and you could see through these veils of mist the big cuts in the land, you know, the big, very subtle tonal differences. And I took a day pack because I had a raincoat in it and a water bottle, and I took my pack off and I put it down on the ground and I lay down. I put my head on the pack, and immediately, and I started thinking, it was like I was pulled into, now I'd already been there for a bunch of weeks, you know, so I was already like, I'd been cooking, and not by choice, I was pulled into a kind of thought stream in which I was asking myself, well, I was saying, you know, I know whose land this is because, you know, that was Tommy Burke's land coming up, and this may be his field also, but where are my fields? Like where are my people? And of course, my family came out of Russia in the early 1920s. We were Russian Jews. And I grew up with my grandfather telling me the stories about the riots, you know, where people would come to the village with knives and swords and, you know, kill the Jews, and his friends would get their heads chopped off. And I started asking myself, who are my people? And I hallucinated a frieze, like from Grunewald. A Grunewald-like frieze of bloodied young boys and girls who were my grandfather's friends as children. And it was like, whoa. And I sat up, and it stopped. And I put my head back down, and it started again. And that night, I went to the pub to have a drink with Kathy. Kathy Herbert was her name. Kathy Herbert. And I was supposed to meet Kathy Herbert at the pub at Polk's to have a conversation. And I told her this story, and her response was, of course. She said, you know, there's history. I mean, you know, I'm just like paraphrasing, but, you know, she told me what you just said, that that this is a recognized kind of experience within Celtic experience, you know, that there is a name for this kind of experience. But, you know, what do I know? I grew up in America. You know, we're driving around listening to the Beach Boys when I was 11 years old, you know. Fun till daddy took the T-bird away, you know. So this idea of like that thin wall is a beautiful idea.
I used it as a title for one of my shows some years ago because it was concerned with those areas in around Carrotag or Ballinglen, or I think it goes back to what Prager says, you know, that whole landscape being so vast, and that light is almost sometimes heavy. I find it's tangible, and I think because of that, and because of how it repaints the landscape, how it constantly moves things around, that it places you in a situation where you're more susceptible to things that aren't really framed in time zones anymore, aren't really framed in cultural areas, aren't really framed in sort of comfort areas that you know about and feel okay in.
Yeah, no, you've said it perfectly, and this is the beauty of the place. that, I mean, what you just said is, I mean, I described a particularly difficult kind of image when I was up in that field, but that's not in any way representative of the kind of experience I had there for all those summers. My experience was kind of ecstatic. Ecstatic, just in terms of what you described, where it's the place wakes up parts of us that we may not even know are there. But that's why we go outside, right? I mean, we're both studio painters at this point, but we still go out and look. But I got to the point where what I needed to do with myself was no longer to go out and sit down with my easel and look at the landscape. That because places have been woken up that require attention. I can still remember the first day we arrived in Ballycastle in '94. We were driving from Ballina, and you know, when you pass Killala and you get those first glimpses of the sea off to the right at about 1 o'clock, I remember it was a day where the sun was going in and out. The sky was the most incredible blue with white clouds that were like whipped cream. And I remember the first glimpse of the water, of the sea, was a blue. I can't really describe it. I can taste it and I could paint it, but it sits in my memory like it was yesterday. And we're coming up to quite a few years, 1994. It was the beginning of the trip. But it was like it in a way, it was satisfying what I expected, but so much more, like what it was implying was so much more. And the so much more is what we come to discover when we're there and are in that place of vulnerability.
And do you think, put it into a context, if I'm here in my studio in Belgium, even painting flowers, of late, I've got the feeling that even if I'm here or anywhere else, I'm still somehow painting Mayo. You know, that somehow it's gotten completely into the texture of who I am. And it has had a huge impact. So, and because of it, when in Mayo or when in here, I can still work with that landscape while in the studio. And I used to have to sit in front of the rock on Ringrose Strand in Ealaíon, and now, because it's not so much about that rock anymore, it's about something else that's much bigger than the rock. But the rock draws it out. And I'm just wondering if you also have that feeling that somehow after those 12 or 13 years having spent every summer in that landscape and, you know, in that light and in that space, if it's still having an impact on how you perceive things now and how you approach things now as a painter.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's really, it's like I lost my virginity as a painter there, you know, so to speak. So, you know, metaphorically speaking, I was taken through an experience of kind of enormous consequence. You know, I discovered myself in well, one part of myself. I mean, it was the beginning of I mean, it wasn't the first discovery, but it was a very important one in terms of, well, you know, I mean, you've been painting for many years. We start somewhere and then we proceed, but we have these sort of riveting and significant experiences along the way from which we never recover. In the best sense. I mean, it's just like, I mean, soldiers would say they never recover from their wounds their wounds may heal, but they never recover. That you always carry with you some trace of your experience. Now, these were not wounds. These were just the opposite. But one can never be the same. I mean, I've never been the same after that. And it's all part of a piece. It's like I can't separate the parts of those summers from each other. They're all tied together. Conversation, meals, driving home from Ballina shopping. I can remember coming home from Ballina and rain was passing and the sun had blasted out and every raindrop was illuminated like a gold coin, and just flooring the accelerator to get back, so I could get out painting. That there's a sense of urgency there, the likes of which I had never felt. I mean, it was like for me meeting the love of my life as a painter, in a way.
Yeah, this is remarkable. And also when you describe that moment when you were out around Carrotag and you had to go back to Ballycastle for a meal, that we had that experience as well. So I used to go out every day working in Ballinglen, in the bog around Carrotag, and then every evening we would head back to the Walgroves cottage in the end. Prior to that, it was the Kenny house, but we were heading back to Ballycastle. We still have to cook. The kids, Tara and Aaron still talk about the typical time of our dinner was 10 o'clock in the evenings.
Of course.
I remember always the difficulty of having to head back because you just wanted to stay there, and because it's so vast there, and the sunsets are remarkable as you described, and because of that, then we found a place out there, but it was determined by Ballinglen and it was determined by Ballycastle, but we ended up finding a place there so that we didn't have to pack in when the sunset just was at its most beautiful point. So we didn't have to eat at 10 in the evening. We could eat at 6 and then go out for a walk. Right. So you recommended the night studio one of our evenings together when we were drinking and eating too much, maybe eating little and drinking too much. But it's traveled around my family. Aaron has read it, Linda has read it, so it's sort of fairly fallen, but it's a marvelous book that I very much enjoyed as other books. So I have nice memories and I still have them via books that you may have mentioned or recommended or something like that. Yeah.
Oh, nice. And Pat, have you seen the documentary that was made about him before he died? It's called Philip Guston, A Life Lived.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's incredible. It's just Guston talking.
Oh, yeah.
It is now you'll find on the internet clips, but on YouTube is the entire film.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
It's an hour, and it is like listening to the voice of a deity speak.
Oh, yeah.
That he was so deep. And
also, they have a lovely Philip Guston in Dublin in the Municipal Gallery.
Ah, really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I bumped into it some years ago. I didn't even know they had it. Yeah. So they don't always hang these things, but it's a lovely one, huh? Yeah.
When I go back, I'll have to visit Dublin. But the thing is, whenever I was over in Mayo, going to the cities was so difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to Dublin, like if someone would have an opening, I would go. But it was like I didn't want to leave Mayo.
But it's nice. Yeah. But I'm in Belgium, so I still spend some of the time in Belgium. When I'm in Belgium, I get to Dublin more often. I fly from Brussels to Dublin for even a day, 2 days, maybe an opening or something. But in Mayo, I never go to Dublin.
Because you don't need it, You don't need it. Yeah, that's great
really
story.
Funny. I never get to Dublin when I did Mayo. I find painting becomes, and you said it in the beginning of the conversation, and painting becomes more and more difficult with time. because it doesn't have any framework. Frameworks and references fall away, and doubt grows. But it's part of the process. It's part of what it's about, and I can cope with this. But I figured I needed more time. I felt that I shouldn't bring my doubts to the studio. I should bring them to my own studio. So
wow.
So
this is. I think we could sit for hours and have this conversation. I mean, you're opening up a huge conversation, which hopefully we'll have in Mayo.
I hope so.
This is, I mean, I could sit here for the rest of the day with this door open.